Hello there everybody, my name is Bloomer Brown and welcome to episode 4 of Kerbal Space Program Retrograde. We are picking it up pretty much where we left off in the last episode. We are in orbit of the moon with a Kethane survey probe, which incidentally is just waking up from hibernation. That beautiful solar eclipse managed to completely drain our batteries and left the probe non-functional for a short period of time. So between episodes I have spent a little bit of time sitting with this probe and running a scan over the surface of the moon, and yeah, there's a couple of blank spots in our data map. Which was to be expected. We've missed out on some around the poles and there's some grey areas here and there, but there is enough to draw at least some conclusions about the surface, and so it is decided that we should try to get this lander portion down onto the surface and perhaps have a closer look at what's going on down there. So switching over, we set ourselves up a maneuver and point myself in the correct direction. This probe is incidentally about to head around to the dark side of the moon, or the far side of the moon where the sun is not shining. Well, it is the dark side, I suppose, technically, because the sun is not shining there, and the only battery power that is available to us is 10 units of electric charge, which is stored in the Probodobodyne Octo. So I am a little bit over enthusiastic with that initial burn, and so you can see me just trying to raise the orbit a little bit and push the periapsis forward, because it is a thing that happens, that you can be making your periapsis low enough for a descent into the crater, only to have yourself converted into a debris cloud by the lip of the crater itself. So yeah, you see our batteries have completely depleted, and just as we come up to the lip of the crater, the sun should begin to rise and our battery returns to normal. So this is the far side crater, which is something of a misnomer, seeing as how it is not exactly on the far side with respect to Kerman, although Kerman hasn't risen yet, and I'm not entirely sure actually if you can see this crater from the surface of Kerman, but it would be interesting to see if that is possible. So I light up my engine and try to use its gimbal to sort of correct myself there, burning a little bit further south than I had originally intended, but then again, this is not a return mission. This is a one-way ticket to the surface of the moon. Again, just making sure that my solar panel is pointed in the right direction before landing, and I begin using my descent engine to null out my horizontal speed so that I can flip it up vertically and just ever so slowly and gently drop it down onto the surface, although we are approaching 100 meters per second at this stage, but we still have over a kilometer to kill that off, and so varying the thrust and just gently pulsing it, I managed to make my way down. A suicide burn would be far more efficient, but with the vast quantity of fuel that I've included on this, I don't think I need to worry about efficiency. And so there we are, the walls of the crater rising up ominously around us as we make our descent. Hopefully we don't land somewhere there is total darkness, though I don't think that's going to be the case. We've got 14 meters left to go. I am running a very, very slight amount of thrust, and it looks like we're going to land on something of a slope. And contact, we are down, and our landing gear sinks into the soft and fine dust on the surface of the moon. Of course, that is not a graphics glitch, that is a product of the dust on the surface. So with ourselves safely down and our solar panel pointed in the right direction, I think it is time to begin doing some science. So we observe the materials bay. You leave the sample bay doors open on the moon and go and do something else for a while. That is a thing that actually happens in Kerbal quite a bit. You can leave things running and go off and do something else. And unfortunately, transmitting this data has drained our battery once again. I should have stuck some batteries on this, but I was just concerned about the weight and trying to build out as small and simple a probe as I could. So I do a little bit of time acceleration and manage to get all of the data transmitted out before deciding to rename this probe as the Lunar probe. I think its name was a little bit long and complicated, and we want to memorialize this site, the site of our first landing on the surface of the moon. No doubt the data that is gone back to Kerman will prove most valuable when we start sending up our crews, because of course this was something of a pathfinding mission, and actually they're using me shutting down the engine. Still quite a bit of fuel left here, and since we have got Kerbal attachment system installed, we may need to make use of that at some stage. And so zooming out, we leave this probe behind on the surface, looking very, 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 very tiny in the vastness of space. And jumping back to the surface of Kerman with a new piece of equipment. We have been time accelerating to allow the sun to rise, and Jebediah is out on the runway with a new thing called an airplane. This vehicle is designed to fly through the atmosphere and not enter space. A strange concept for Jeb, but he seems to be having a good time. Now, because I have angled the wings ever so slightly, it should be possible for this thing to take off without touching the controls at all. And it does indeed, and we fold in the landing gear, and we're picking up quite a bit of speed. And as I say, Jeb is loving it. So we are out on a mission. We are going to be gathering some science while we are running this test flight. I've decided that I'm going to flip around through and head out to the west to gather some data from the desert. That's a biome that I don't think we have very much data from at the moment, so it will be an interesting thing, or it's an ice mission rather, to head out and start testing this aircraft. And immediately I start to notice that there is some problems with the nose being a little bit too heavy on this thing. A little bit of work needed to hold attitude in the way I would like. And just look at those volumetric clouds as we make a climb to altitude. Not entirely sure how high this thing can get yet, but I'm expecting it to top out somewhere around 10 kilometers. We should be able to pull enough air in to feed that engine up to that altitude. And yeah, just enjoying the view. The surface, of course, the moon is visible there, and whoa, coming out of time acceleration seems to bring that nose down quite a bit, and I seem to have no end of trouble pulling the nose up. So clearly there is something wrong with the centre of lift and centre of mass there, so I'm going to need to take that back into the VAB and do a little bit of work, and I may even adjust the landing gear a little bit. So yeah, we have got a bit of a ways to go to get out to the desert, and what I'm probably going to do is do one of those slick swipe effects and bring us over to a point where Jebediah is on descent. So yes, it tops out a little over 11 kilometers up actually, and then it's it loses efficiency and loses thrust and starts to come down again because it's not, the engines are starved of air. So yeah, making our descent through the rather thick cloud cover that is over the surface of Kerman today. This is actually quite terrifying because when the clouds clear, you're almost expecting to find a mountainside, even though I know that there is no mountain in this region. And so just grabbing a little bit of science, Jebediah still laughing like a maniac as he begins to bring this jet down, realizing that he is going a little bit slow, or at least losing a little bit of speed, and worried about stalling this thing. And yeah, we bank over and try to line ourselves up with this. I decide to try and land uphill. I know that the brakes on this landing gear aren't all that strong. I should have probably fitted a drogue chute just to help out in an emergency, but I haven't done that yet, so we are just going to try and use the slope of the land to bring ourselves to a stop. Also switching on the landing lights there. That's going to give me an indication of when I am approaching the ground. I still haven't got my shadows turned back on. It may have been a case that they were lagging the game when I installed this particular version. So that may be an explanation as to why we have no shadows. So bringing it down, using a very little amount of thrust just to kind of keep myself going. If I need to spool those engines up, it shouldn't take too long. We're down below 100 meters. We're definitely getting close. Jebediah making final corrections, flaring and a little bit of lag. And contact, we're down and hit the brakes and we're kind of bouncing on the rough terrain. Oh, this is not an ideal landing site at all. It is quite flat. It's quite smooth. Oh, it's going uphill. Oh, he's tipping. And he's recovered. Not too bad. That is taking far too long to slow down indeed. A drogue chute would indefinitely be useful on something like this. And finally, after, I don't know, it must be a couple of 100 meters, we managed to finally bring the aircraft to a stop. And I think it's time to start with the science survey. So we're going to get Jeb out and he's going to do his crew reports and record his musings on the situation, so flying above the desert. And yep, so just firing through the science experiments. We're going to recover all of these and bring them back. We're not going to bother transmitting anything from the aircraft. No, actually we do not have any communications devices aboard. So it's time for the soil sample. And unfortunately I've placed the ladder a little bit too far forward and Jebediah is having trouble getting down, but he does eventually manage to get down and takes a sample of the sand. Lots of rocks and sand here. You're thankful that you've been in a climate controlled environment because it sure looks hot out there. The sand is dry and loose and looks like it's going to take some effort to clean your gear afterwards. And we grab a quick EVA report and place a flag to mark out this location as having yielded as much science as we can gather at this point. So it's over to you, Jebediah, and he decides to start writing that we came for the science. It's like the beach, but hotter and drier. But Jeb came anyway in the name of science and of course testing his new aircraft, which does seem to be a little nose heavy. So with that out of the way, I have a look around and decide that I'm probably going to try and take off to the east so we get Jebediah back aboard the aircraft and begin retracting the ladder. Now I can tell you that this didn't go exactly according to plan. So as I say, I'm going to try and turn the craft over to the east, and so I start throttling up the engine and get very little response from it and start throttling up a little more, not remembering of course that these engines take a little bit of time to spool up. And I try to arrest my motion and things start to get a little bit out of control and Jebediah is fighting with the aircraft trying to keep it stable, and we've lost our first wing and begin to tumble and roll across the surface of the desert and destroy most of the aircraft. Luckily though, the command pod has survived, as has Jebediah Kerman. He is heard to make some remark over the radio about any landing you can walk away from is a good one, when Bill Kerman reminds him of course that he was not attempting to land the spacecraft. Luckily we have still got a couple of science experiments intact, and we have the crew reports from Jeb as well, so we're going to recover this back to the KSC and gain what data we can and begin redesigning this aircraft to make it a little bit easier to fly. And as we return to the KSC, we become aware that we are not the only ones having problems with flight hardware. Probodobodyne have offered us a contract to retrieve Frodock Kerman from orbit, and we scramble a craft together using the 1.25 meter launcher that I was developing in the last episode. Incidentally, I have worked out some of the problems and seem to have gotten rid of some of the roll issues I was having. So it's essentially the same rocket, although there is a slightly reduced fuel tank on that upper stage, just because I don't think I am going to need all of that fuel to get myself into orbit and rendezvous with Frodock's spacecraft. Incidentally, I have also got no fairing on this, mostly because I forgot, but I think even in modern versions of Kerbal that would fly pretty well. I don't think the RCS thrusters would affect the flight of the spacecraft through the atmosphere. So on with the launch. I am attempting a maneuver that I haven't done in a really long time, and only managed to pull off a couple of times once I had developed standard flight hardware, and that is to go straight from the launch pad into a rendezvous. So you can see me jumping out to the map there and trying to set this thing up, guessing where my apoapse is going to be roughly. And even as I launched this thing, I was fairly certain that Frodock had passed a little bit too far overhead. The angle should be somewhere around 30 degrees, I think. 45 degrees is far too high, and usually it will overshoot, but the angles will be different depending on the vessel you're launching and the actual orbital parameters of what you're trying to rendezvous with. But I try to do it as best I can, trying to line up my ascending or descending node, as the case may be, with my apoapsis, and trying to get both of them somewhere in the middle of my closest approach. Which obviously I didn't do because I launched a little bit too late. So you can see me fiddling around with the maneuver node there, trying to get things lined up and get some sort of an encounter. Incidentally, if you look on the left hand side of my nav ball, you can see why I am having a little bit of trouble in setting this up and keep going back, fiddling around with it. I have left the engine running just a little bit. I must have fat fingered the throttle as I was trying to set that up. So I go back, shut off the engine and begin trimming this maneuver, and just fiddling with the maneuver nodes, trying to get my encounter down, and it's getting pretty close. Any little change there seems to throw it off quite a bit, and we're getting down 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 3.1, 2.8. That's getting better. Incidentally, we are still on a suborbital trajectory and approaching apoapsis, so I need to get things figured out pretty quickly, and just getting ready for the burn. You'll also notice that I am flying in target relative mode straight from launch. I find that helps when you're trying to do this type of maneuver. And after a little bit of time acceleration, I reach my maneuver and begin burning, deleting it as I go. I'm trying to use Kerbal Engineer to bring up my data, but it seems that the intercept distance is referring to the first closest approach as opposed to the second, so I abandon that and just go and use the map to try and trim things down a little bit. You can see me very gently thrusting there, bringing us down below 1 kilometer, 0.9, 700 meters, 300 meters, 0.1 kilometers, just somewhere around 100 meters. Now there is a risk with these kind of maneuvers that you will neglect your orbital parameters, and I have neglected mine. If you look at Kerbal Engineer there, my apoapsis is a little bit low, and you can still see me just fiddling around with the maneuver nodes there, trying to get that approach down. Or what I think I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out how much delta V I will need to burn to just reduce things a little bit, just to give me an idea. And I still haven't noticed that my apoapsis is a little bit low, and so eventually I do realize that my apoapsis is a little bit low, and I swing about to try and correct that, finding the right direction and thrusting just to bring it up above 70 kilometers. Now that kind of a little dip into the atmosphere probably wouldn't deorbit this spacecraft. But it would kind of mess up my encounter. The drag would slow down my orbit, and so we time accelerate around, gradually closing the distance, and you can see that the relative velocity is dropping there. So I come back out of the map screen and start to try to trim things down a little bit with my RCS thrusters, which have kind of been placed in not exactly the right position. So I just mouse over the intersection there and begin trimming down my encounter. Incidentally, if you look at the flight engineer, you will notice that my relative inclination is increasing because I'm using the wrong translation controls as I trim this, but the average encounter is on average getting slightly smaller, so I don't actually notice that that's happening. And we're back out of the map, and we are on terminal approach to Frodock, Kerman, and I'm just using the main engines to try and trim this down, just because they've got a little more thrust. And yeah, you can see it getting down 0.4 kilometers, 0.2, 0.1. We're going to meet him less than a kilometer away, and our target relative velocity is actually pretty low. We've got about 67 meters per second to kill off there, and we can see that he is coming in pretty close indeed. So at this point I am still very much focused on the nav ball and my relative velocities, and I am just waiting to try and see the spacecraft, not realizing at this stage that I am aiming for a very, very small target. And I think it's at about this stage that I realize, as he comes a little bit closer to us, that Frodock Kerman is not in a spacecraft. He is actually just floating around up here in a spacesuit. So I am not entirely sure what went wrong, but it seems that poor Frodock was abandoned in orbit. Well, not abandoned, they called us in to try and get him back down, but it seems that whatever mission was being carried out up here was something of a failure. So just ever so carefully bringing myself in and bringing my spacecraft to a stop a little bit over 20 meters away from Frodock Kerman. And yeah, he is literally just floating out here in a spacesuit. So we switch over to him, and he obviously has no idea that a spacecraft has showed up behind him until we send a radio message over to him. He wakes himself up and activates his RCS pack to have a look around for the spacecraft, to find a large rocket nozzle pointed directly at his head, and begins making his way towards the recovery vessel. Now, using the RCS pack can be an intimidating thing in Kerbal Space Program, especially if you're not used to it. The key, of course, is to get things aligned to make things a little bit easier on yourself. And there you can see me switching on the blue lights of the rescue vessel and switching back to Frodock. So yeah, the key is to take things slow and steady. You have got plenty of time to conduct these maneuvers, since everything is safely in orbit and not moving very fast relative to each other. Incidentally, this footage is sped up to 4 times time, just to make things happen a little bit quicker for the video. So as we jump in, we grab an EVA report from space just above the deserts, and as any Kerbal player will know, being above the deserts of Kerman means only one thing, that it is a good point to attempt a direct descent to the KSC. So looking to show off for Frodock, I attempt to conduct another maneuver that I haven't done in a while, and begin burning my engines to bring down my orbital path to land somewhere around the middle of the ocean, and do a few final checks, switching off the lights and things like that, getting ready to re-enter the atmosphere early. This spacecraft actually hasn't even completed a single orbit at this point and is getting ready to return to the surface. So just pointing myself in the right direction and burning a little just to correct my latitude. I'm not entirely sure what the longitude of the KSC is, but I know that it is pretty much centered on the equator, so a latitude of 0 degrees is something worth aiming for. At about this stage I become concerned that I may overshoot just a little bit, and so I start burning my engines just to slow down a little bit. And just making my way in, it is quite intimidating looking down at it, but you can see the KSC is starting to load, and I select my launch clamps, I think, as a target, and begin slowing down a little more, just angling myself to try and keep my latitude about 0, or as close to 0 as I can. And I cut the engines and give it a little bit of time, and I think that I'm probably going to fall short just a little bit, so I light up the engine once again and burn off the last of the fuel. It is in fact probably not a bad thing that I'm going to fall short as I eject that booster and send it down towards Kerman. It would more than likely shower the KSC with rocket debris, although that's not anything of a rare occurrence at the KSC, I would assume. So just trying to gain a little bit more distance with my RCS thrusters there. And we deploy our parachutes and begin the descent with Frodock, looking a little bit worried down in the bottom right there. Now as I'm coming down, I notice that my velocity is a little bit high once my parachutes open. So I begin using my RCS thrusters. Now the thrust provided by these is going to give me a little bit of braking power, but the effect of it is not going to be dramatic. Now the reason I'm burning it off is to try and reduce the weight of my vessel, and as you can see from Kerbal Engineer, my terminal velocity is indeed decreasing as my mass decreases. And so yeah, we are just going to try and burn off as much of this as we can, because I'm not sure what kind of an impact this thing can take. Now something like TAC fuel balancer would be useful in this case, since it would allow us to simply dump the fuel rather than trying to burn it off. So just getting down there, we are down below 50 meters. Slowing down, and we touch down safely. And we get Frodock out to have a little walk around on the surface, glad to be home, no doubt, and taking some scientific data and planting a flag. Frodock Kerman was here, following a daring rescue mission in orbit. We are still not entirely sure how he managed to get there or what became of his spacecraft. So I spent a little bit of time gathering up some screenshots for a thumbnail, and before recovering the vessel, giving us some science and some funds, of course, from the spare parts we managed to recover. And of course we also recovered Frodock Kerman and receive an update on how he is doing. Well done, Frodock Kerman has been rescued in one piece and is now enjoying a thorough debriefing from the comfort of his quarantine cell. Frodock Kerman is now part of your crew roster and may be assigned to future missions. The specifics of those missions will no doubt be finalised in future episodes. Until then, I am going to take this opportunity to say thank you very much for tuning in. You have been watching Bloomer Brown on YouTube, and I will see you next time.